Welcome to your deep dive. So we're diving into prep for your practicum experience today and using what can go into a lesson to help us design language lessons that really click with students.
Yeah, and we'll go beyond just lesson plans. We'll really dig into the emotional side of language learning for your students and for you as teachers, too.
Right. Like remember that first day of school feeling all those nerves? Okay, now add trying to speak a whole new language on top of that.
Exactly. It can be a lot, and it's something we have to remember as we get ready to teach. It's amazing how much those experiences stick with us, even years later. That's why the source material really pushes reflecting on your own time as a language learner. Like how those classes make you feel. Were there any teaching styles that you loved or hated?
Oh, totally. I had this Spanish teacher who dressed up as different characters to teach us verbs.
Oh, wow.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It was so out there, but it worked. And those memories are crystal clear because they were tied to those emotions.
And there's actual science behind that. The way our brains work means emotions play a huge role in how well we remember things. So if something's engaging or funny or even just a little weird, we're way more likely to remember it.
That makes sense. But how do we translate that to our own classrooms, especially when we're still figuring things out ourselves during the practicum?
It really starts with building that safe and supportive environment for your students, a place where it's okay to mess up those new words or make mistakes, even laugh at yourself a little along the way.
Because, let's be real, mistakes are going to happen. I once accidentally told my host family in Italy that I loved eating horses.
Oh, no.
Instead of saying I loved horseback riding, I was mortified.
I bet you never made that mistake again. Those oops moments often end up being the best learning experiences. It's about helping your students see those mistakes not as failures, but as chances to learn and grow.
Which makes me think about this whole reflective practitioner idea. What does that actually look like day to day, especially for those of us just starting out?
Think of it like an ongoing conversation you're having with yourself about your teaching. So after each lesson, take a few minutes to just think about what went well, what didn't, how were your students reacting, those sorts of things.
So it's like hitting pause after a play and taking stock. What worked? What needs tweaking before the next act?
Exactly. And this source material is all about giving you the tools to direct that growth. This deep dive, and your practicum too, they're not about being perfect right away, but more about trying things, experimenting, and building that confidence as you go. And, part of that experimentation is trying new things in your lessons. And this source material, what can go into a lesson, it really digs into this idea of language patterns. Instead of just memorizing lists of vocabulary, how about giving students those chunks of language, the phrases native speakers actually use?
Oh, that makes sense. So like instead of just I go, you go, we teach them let's go or are you going? Giving them those ready-made pieces for real conversations.
Exactly. It helps them sound more fluent even if they haven't mastered every single grammar rule yet. Which reminds me, this source material really stresses teaching those grammatical patterns too. The underlying structures of the language.
Right, so things like sentence structure and word order, but those can seem kind of abstract. How do we make them stick for our students, especially in those short practicum lessons?
One way is to focus on those generative patterns, the ones they can use in tons of different situations. Like instead of just teaching he likes ice cream, teach them subject plus verb plus object, which they can then use to make all sorts of sentences.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's about giving them the tools to build their own sentences, not just repeating what they've memorized.
Exactly. And as they get comfy with those patterns, then you can get into those variations and more complex structures.
It's a process, right?
Yeah.
And you're there to guide them through it. This is making me think about when I was learning a new language. I remember feeling so stuck when it came to actually speaking. Like I knew the grammar, I could read, but having a conversation was terrifying. How do we help our students bridge that gap to go from knowing the rules to actually using the language confidently, especially in those real-life situations they'll have during their practicum?
I think that's where those language functions are so key. It's all about teaching them how to use the language for specific purposes. So think about common scenarios your students might encounter during their practicum: ordering food, asking for directions, introducing themselves.
Oh, and what about navigating those little awkward moments, like if they accidentally say something wrong or need to ask someone to repeat themselves?
Exactly. Those real-life situations are the perfect way to practice those language functions in a way that actually means something. You can even role-play those situations in class so they get a chance to practice in a safe space before they head out for their practicum.
I love that. It's like a dress rehearsal before the big performance.
Yeah.
But we've got to talk about those core language skills too. Listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Do we need to teach those one by one, or can we mix them up during those short practicum lessons?
It's a common myth that you have to master one skill before moving on to the next. Truth is, all four are connected, and you can totally develop them all at the same time. Think of it like having different colors of paint. You can use each color on its own, but when you start mixing them, you get something way more interesting.
Right, it's like you're adding more dimension. You get something way more dynamic when you blend those skills together.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we want for our students, right? To give them that full set of skills so they can really communicate out there in the real world.
So how do we actually create those kinds of lessons, especially with the limited time we have during a practicum?
Well, it's all about finding those creative ways to weave everything together, the vocab, the grammar, the skills, even the cultural context. Like the source material gives us example of teaching a unit on travel. So instead of just drilling airport vocabulary, what if you have them role play navigating an airport in another country, checking in, ordering food, asking for directions, all that.
Oh, I love that. That gets them using the language in a way that feels real.
Exactly. And they get to see how much they can actually understand and say, which can be really motivating.
For sure. It's like suddenly it's not just about memorizing words anymore. It's about using them for something you might actually need to do.
Right. And speaking of making it real, the source material talks a lot about using relatable themes too.
So instead of just random grammar points or vocab lists, we could base our lessons around themes like friendship, honesty, things like that. Stuff that students really connect with.
Exactly. It just makes the language more meaningful, and it also gives you a framework to explore different language functions and vocabulary. Like, let's say you're doing a unit on friendship. You could have them role play, making new friends, maybe resolving a disagreement, expressing gratitude. So many possibilities.
I'm seeing how much richer that is than just like lecturing about what a verb is.
Definitely.
And it reminds me of how powerful stories and literature can be. Speaking of which, this source material is big on bringing those into our teaching. But how do we go beyond just reading a story aloud, especially as new teachers?
I think of literature as a way to really get to the heart of a culture. It shows students how the languages actually use those different perspectives, all the little things that make communication flow. Even just using songs or poems can make a lesson so much more engaging.
It's about sparking that interest, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just about the words themselves, but the whole world behind them.
Exactly. And those insights are so important, especially because these students are about to head out on their practicums where they'll be interacting with people from all different backgrounds.
It's really hitting me how much goes into teaching a language. It's so much more than I ever realized back when I was a student.
It really is.
It's about more than just grammar rules and pop quizzes. It's about inspiring your students to connect with the world in a whole new way.
Yeah, and arming them with the skills to do it confidently.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to have years of experience to be a great teacher. Go into your practicum with curiosity, be creative, and just be excited to connect with your students, and I know you're going to do amazing things.
I totally agree.
And remember, as you start this exciting new journey of teaching, we're here to support you every step of the way. Until next time, keep those learning sparks flying.